Today we're going to talk about conjugating verbs in the present tense. As I said before, conjugations are the laying out of all of the particular verb forms in every person and number for a particular tense. So remember the terms that I'm talking about here. So person, that equals first, second, or third. So first, second, or third person. So I or we, you or y'all, he, she, it, or they. Okay, so what person, it tells us what person is doing the action of the verb. And number, that is singular or plural. So singular I, plural we, singular he, plural they, etc. Okay, so you'll see that when I set up my charts for conjugating verbs, there are essentially 6 slots. So they're divided into singular and plural with each of the 3 persons. Okay, so singular, plural, first, second, third person in each. So let's talk about verb conjugations in Latin. Latin has effectively 5 conjugations of verbs. They're 5 different ways that verbs are conjugated, and then a bunch of irregular verbs. We'll learn those individually as we go along. But these 5 conjugations that I'm talking about are conjugations that follow a regular pattern, so you can learn how one of them works and then apply it across the board to all other verbs of that particular conjugation. Now, the conjugations we're going to be learning today, or at first, are 2 of them. So the first of these is called the long A conjugation, or some people call it the first. I like to call it the long A because it's a descriptive name that will help us determine. It tells us information about the conjugation rather than just having to remember another number in our head. Also, it can help them from getting confused with declensions, which also have numbers. So if you can remember it as the long A conjugation, it'll be, I think, a little less confusing for you in the future. Also, the other one we're going to be learning is the long E conjugation. Some people call it the second conjugation, but once again, I like long E because it's descriptive. Now, why are they called by these particular names? Well, the way that we find out to which conjugation a particular verb belongs is we go to the second of the 4 principal parts of the verb. So you remember from when we learned some, I mentioned that all verbs have 4 principal parts. And we'll learn, of course, what these do over the course of time. But for right now, just know that each verb has 4 of them, and that when you learn them as a vocabulary entry, you should be memorizing these to save yourself work in the future. So, how do we find out what conjugation a verb belongs to? Well, we need to look at the second of these principal parts. So I've put the first 2 principal parts of verbs here on the board for us so we can see them. The first verb we're going to be looking at is the verb vocare, which means to call. You can see VOC, that root in there. It means something to do with the voice. So we have the word vocal, vocalize. So voice, things like this. So it means to call. Well, how do we tell what conjugation it belongs to? Simply enough, we go to the second principal part of the verb, vocare, which happens to be the present infinitive. We'll learn more about those in the future as well. The present infinitive form. So vocare means to call. Okay? So to call, we go to the second principal part to find out what conjugation it's in, and we see that here, before the RE of this form, there is, in fact, a long A. So that's how we know that it belongs to the long A conjugation. Well, how do long A conjugation verbs conjugate? Well, what happens is you take how any verb conjugates basically is you take a verb stem and you add a set of endings to it, to a set of personal endings to mark out what person and number it is. So here at the top of the board, what I've done is I've listed out our set of active personal endings. You should call them active personal endings because there are different ones for when we get into passive verbs, but don't worry about that for right now. But these are the active personal endings. The first person singular ends in an O or an M, okay? So you'll see here, woko, a long O. Let's put our mark over that. A long O tells us first person singular, okay? So we know that then this principal part, woko, is the first person singular present tense form of the verb to call. So the second person singular personal ending is an S. The third person singular is a T. In the plural, the first person plural ends in mus, M-U-S. Second person plural ends in tis, T-I-S. And third person plural ends in unt, N-T. Okay? And these should look somewhat familiar to us, okay, if we recall our conjugation of the verb sum. If we remember, if we conjugate it very quickly, sum, est, sumus, estis, sunt. Okay? And we can see each of these personal endings here added to these things to mark out for us what person and number they are. Okay? So let's conjugate a long A conjugation verb. Let's conjugate woko, wokare, I call. Woko is the first person singular. I call. Second person singular, wokas. All right, so note this form here is this form. Okay, the first principal part is the first person singular of the present tense. Woko, wokas, wokot. Notice a T, O-S-T. He, she, it calls. In the plural, wokamus, we call. Second person plural, wokatis. Y'all call. And in the third person plural, wokant, they call. All right. So you see how that works? Woko, wokas, wokot, wokamus, wokatis, wokant. Say it to yourself a few times to get it into your head. Get the sound of it in your head. Woko, wokas, wokot, wokamus, wokatis, wokant. Woko, woko, wokas, wokot, wokamus, wokatis, wokant. I call, you call, he, she, it calls. We call, y'all call, they call. All right. So very quickly, let's run through the long E conjugation. Just as we found that woko, wokare belongs to the long A, we find that habeo, habere, which means to have or to hold, belongs to the long E conjugation. It has a long E there. So this is how these go. Habeo, I have. Adding the same personal endings now. Habes, you have. Habet, he, she, it has. Habemus, we have. Habetis, y'all have. And habent, they have. Okay, so there you have it. The conjugation in the present tense, active forms of the long A conjugation and the long E conjugation. So practice with these. get the hang of them. Oh, and I should make a mention of how we translate these things, right? So I've translated these as I call, you call, he, she, it calls. Well, just so you know, the present tense in Latin can actually be translated three different ways. Not just I call, but we can also translate it I am calling or I do call. So, Wokos, you are calling, or you call, or you do call. Wokot, he, she, it calls, he, she, it is calling, or he, she, it does call. Okay, so keep that in mind when we're working on our translations. There might be a place where one of those three translations would be more appropriate than the others. So there you have it. Conjugations in the present tense of the long A and long E conjugations of verbs.